Welcome, everyone. I'm Mike Adams with WHYY. Thanks for being here. We had a very interesting discussion, I would say, as we were all getting together, and we've sort of come together to take a look at questions that, in our sense, we're trying to represent you, what you might ask, what you might want to know, and to give everyone a chance to have a little bit more of an understanding of this really important topic. I am not a geneticist. I don't even play one on TV. But I will say this, the folks we have with us tonight come at this from very different angles. But we, I think, have come to a set of questions and discussions that you'll walk away informed. So rather than me try to tell you who they are, I'm going to let them tell you who they are themselves, and I'll start with you, Tim.
Hello, I'm Theodore Saylor. I'm a professor of anthropology here at Penn, and my area of research is what we call molecular anthropology or anthropological genetics. And I've spent the past couple of decades focusing a lot on the question of the peopling of the Americas and the ancestral relationships to populations in Siberia.
And I'm Sarah Tishkoff. I am a professor in genetics and biology here at Penn. And I'm a human evolutionary geneticist, and I am interested in characterizing genomic diversity around the world, but with an emphasis in Africa. And Africa is a region that's been really underrepresented in human genetic studies, and for that reason, myself and students and collaborators in Africa have been doing field work, and we integrate that with laboratory studies and computational analyses to make inferences about human evolution, adaptation, and the genetic basis of disease.
Hello, everyone. I'm Fatima Jackson. I'm a professor of biology at Howard University. I'm trained in biological anthropology. My area of interest is human biology, contemporary human genetic variation, with an emphasis on the diversity found in peoples of recent African descent. And it's a pleasure to be here and to see the Morton specimens up front. We always learned about them. I have been very interested in population substructure within peoples of African descent, primarily African Americans, and developing strategies for the comprehensive genetic testing of African peoples, as Dr. Tishkoff indicated, the homeland of humanity and the basis for much of our genetic variation.
I'm Quayshawn Spencer. I'm also a professor here at University of Pennsylvania. I'm in the Department of Philosophy, so I'm not a geneticist. But I do work in an area that's relevant, philosophy of biology and philosophy of race. So I actually try to figure out what sort of philosophical problems exist in the genetic research related to race, and figure out how to solve those problems, how to ask those questions, solve those problems. So for example, if someone wants to say race isn't biologically real, I'll step back and ask, well, what do we mean by biologically real? What do we mean by race, right? And that's the sort of stuff I do.
Hello, I'm Ahmad Misharik. I'm from Amsterdam, actually, from the Netherlands. I'm a professor in anthropology of science. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I actually do anthropological work among scientists. So I spent 2 years working in laboratories, genetic laboratories, studying human genetic diversity, hands-on, like doing the sequencing also myself to understand how certain normativities are also embedded in the technologies, in the statistics, in the routines, in the protocols, et cetera, focusing on genetic diversity, and that has slowly moved in a current project that I'm now doing, which is a large project with 5 PhD students and 2 postdocs and myself, which is a project that is called Race-Face Idea. So race-face identification, it is looking into forensic practices and looking at how the way we try to give a face to an unknown person, a suspect or a victim, how that process of individualization goes hand in hand with the process of locating a person in a population, but also the moment knowledge starts to move from one place to the other, this population tends to be translated sometimes in race. So I'm focusing very specifically at that process of translation from the research and development to the forensic laboratories, to the police stations, in the media, and finally in the courtroom. What happens in that process? So.
Thanks. We can start with you because it's, you brought it up in your talk. So how do we measure genetic variation within and between populations?
So the technology has really changed dramatically in the last, I'd say, 5 years or so. So we're at a point, people classically used to study things like blood polymorphisms. Everybody, I think, has heard about ABO, blood polymorphisms. And they would actually look at differences in the proteins. But nowadays, people are looking at DNA, and we're actually now sequencing entire genomes. So we've gotten to the point where we can sequence a genome for about $1,500. And so it's really a whole new world at this point. But we are, of course, limited by the material that's out there and that's available. And historically, most of the genetics research has been on non-African populations. And for a number of reasons, a lack of resources, some of the challenges of working in Africa, there just hasn't been a good representation. So it's biasing our perspective of what diversity looks like. But all of the studies to date have shown clearly an African origin, that people, when we left Africa in the last 50,000 to 100,000 years, and I should point out that the DNA data suggests that modern humans arose about 200,000 years ago. It's consistent with the archaeological data, fossil data, and then about 50 to 100,000 years ago migrated out of Africa, populating the rest of the globe. And so if you think of it that way, that's not a lot of time for diversity to accumulate. And at a genome level, we are 99.9% or greater similar as a species. And then as we migrated out of Africa, there's sort of a subset of the diversity comes out of Africa, and as you keep migrating, people migrated west to east across Eurasia. There were founding events and a decrease in diversity. And then we now know, to make matters a little bit more complicated, that when our ancestors left Africa, they ran into archaic populations like Neanderthals, people might have heard of, and they appear to have interbred. So now roughly 2 to 6% of the genomes of people outside of Africa actually are descended from those populations.
And you made a point backstage about the differences, what we took from one, what we took from the other.
Yes, a lot of the Neanderthal genes that Dr. Tishkoff has spoken of affect cognitive processes as well as testicular processes. So we know that, for example, there are some HLA polymorphisms that show up in Scandinavia that are actually derived from Neanderthals, or that show up in Southeast Asia that are probably derived from Denisovan, another archaic group. So that's led to the idea that maybe we're a hybrid species.
Why do some people object to the study of variation? That's something you've looked at.
In what sense?
Well, object to the study of variation within population. I mean, there's some objection to that.
Well, there's ethical concerns some people have. I think some people were talking about before, it's hard to get certain groups of humans to volunteer for these sorts of studies. I know I've talked to some population geneticists who have tried to get sort of buy-in for certain indigenous American tribal groups and so forth, and it's difficult because they've had a bad history with white scientists in the United States and scientific research. So there's certainly some ethical concerns there.
And it matters in things like clinical trials and things.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, if we don't have the appropriate reference database, then we can't make the inferences. They won't be robust. And so we've been lacking in a strong African reference base, which means that the chances of developing precision medicine for peoples of African descent is much more limited than for peoples of European descent, who we know much more about, even though it's a smaller geographical region. So ancestry is at the foundation of all of these technological innovations that we want to use in applied genomics, such as pharmacogenetics and pharmacogenomics and precision medicine and so forth. Without the reference database, we don't know what we're looking at.
What's the biggest change in biological thinking about race in the last 10 years?
Could I just comment on the previous quickly, just to complicate it a little bit, because I fully agree with Professor Jackson with the importance of these reference populations for the studies of medicines. But we also remember in '95 when the Human Genome Diversity Project was, well, embarked on, so to speak, that this caused lots of dismay. And I appreciate that you know what this is about, you know, this population genetic project, international project, to map human genetic diversity in order to understand where we came from as human beings and how this diversity has come about. And of course, many indigenous populations have protested against this vampire project, the project that is after our genes for their white European purposes, right, and benefits. So there is always this complication in there, and we need to keep those, to hang on to those two politics.
How do you change their minds? How would you change their minds, or can you?
I'm not so sure whether we should.
I comment on that because I do that kind of research.
Yeah, I mean, I think things have moved on, and there are many. Have been many conversations and also many commitments made, right, in return of benefits, etc., etc. But I do find it actually important to keep these two things when we talk about race. There's always these two possibilities. You can't get rid of race. Maybe I'm running now behind, already ahead of the conversation. But I think if we want to discuss something as contingent and as contested as race, we need to keep the good and the bad together because they're potentially both there. So just a footnote maybe.
So you brought up the Human Genome Diversity Project, and I think a big problem with that was started, let me see.
95.
Gosh. Oh, no, the Diversity Project actually would have been earlier. That would have been like, gosh, 80 something, because that was Ken Kidd and Luca Cavalli.
That's the Human Genome Project.
Okay, but they started a project to look at diversity, and they got cell lines from populations around the world. That was in the 80s.
Yes.
And at that time, we didn't really have great processes for informed consent. And we didn't have the kind of review that we do now. And in fact, at that time, for many, if not most of those studies, where they went around the world and they collected cells, you know, from blood, I don't think they even asked for consent. I don't think they even had written consent, and they never returned the results.
Right.
They didn't keep people informed. Now, sadly, this still happens. It happens a lot. And my lab, for example, we've made a lot of effort to make sure that this research is done in an ethical manner. And I do believe it can be, because you have to work together with people locally. You have to have collaborators. You have to explain projects in a way that people can understand. Make sure you get community consent if possible, and then ultimately have to get individual consent. And the other thing is we make sure we go back and give the results back to people. They really, really appreciate it. And in terms of the concerns, I think that Native Americans have a lot of concerns about genetic studies because they conflict with their own ideas about ancestry.
Exactly.
In Africa, it has been the opposite. I can say that they really were interested in learning more about the ancestry and would kind of interweave it with their own stories. It wasn't as big a concern, so I think it's culturally dependent. The other thing is, if we didn't have those studies, I think we wouldn't have been able to break up or get rid of this biological concept of race. It was actually the studies of all the diversity in global populations that blew that apart, because it basically showed that people are not clustering by what we are calling racial, classifications. And in fact, my own work has shown that there's more diversity in Africa than in the whole globe. So what is this about an African race? I mean, it's pretty much impossible. But if those studies hadn't been done, I think people would not even have known that.
Right. I would agree. And we also want to compliment those of us who have brought in indigenous people, trained them, and had them go back to their own communities and do this genetic work. So people like Keolo Fox, who is Hawaiian, has been really instrumental in getting good training in genetics and then designing a project to look at Polynesian genetic diversity from an indigenous perspective. And so we need more of that, we need to broaden the number of scientists as well as broaden the databases that are being studied and the interpretation of those databases.
The average person who no matter where they are, who might undergo a genetic test, they clearly will find themselves traced back to Africa, in your mind?
Well, it depends on the reference database, you know, because many of the reference databases are more recent historical ancestry. So you'll pick up a segment of DNA that is commonly found in Finland, but if you trace its origins back, it goes to Africa. But that information of where in Africa is not known. We are really, and I criticized this years ago in saying, why don't we look at Africa first? And then from Africa, since it's the homeland of the species, then trace the migrations out. And this is some of the work that Dr. Tishkoff and others have done, but we don't have enough of it because the continent is huge. And we're just getting around to beginning to do systematic genomic testing of continental Africa.
Is it a money? Is it a time? Is it what is the issue that?
So it's a combination. A lot of it has been funding. We typically get our money from the National Institutes of Health, and historically there's an emphasis on U.S. populations, right? And they have recently started to fund more research in Africa. There's a project called H3 Africa, which is a great start, but there's a lot still that has to be done. And in regards, and then also there's just the logistics. So we study mainly minority populations that are living indigenous lifestyles. So just to get to these groups requires a four-wheel drive vehicle, if not two. We have to bring all of our laboratory, all of our equipment with us and set up a lab in the field. Typically, it would take us about 7 months per research expedition and hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's extremely challenging to do. And then because we want to do this in a proper ethical way, we have to get permission. So you start with permission at your university, and then you have to go to the government and whichever country you're in, working with collaborators. We go through reviews. I would say on average it takes 5 years for each region that we go to.
Same in Europe?
Oh, much easier in Europe.
Much easier, of course.
Much easier.
Yeah.
Why is it easier in Europe?
Infrastructure.
Yes, the infrastructure, of course, it is there. In many cases, you don't have to even go to the people because they have already submitted their sample for other purposes and undersigned the form saying that it can be used for research purposes. So you have the samples in the hospital. You simply go to the -20 or something, get your samples and do your research.
Actually are interested in their own heritage. They want to be able to work with researchers basically in a partnership and on their own terms. So Sarah Tishkoff, Dr. Tishkoff follows a similar model working with African communities where the notion is sort of a community-based participatory model where you basically are working together to address various questions of interest, whether they're disease-related, whether they have to do with ancestry or heritage. And we've been fortunate enough to work both in Siberia and the Americas with communities who are interested in their own histories. So if you work in Siberia, though, you are talking about villages that are hundreds of kilometers. So it's actually a real privilege to be able to work in the
project. We're seeing research coming out of India, but these are their own countries developing the technology, testing their own people. We don't have anything like that in Africa. And, it's spotty throughout the globe. We need much more research to be done. And I would say, just to tie it back to the topic of tonight's discussion, that probably racial ideas actually inhibits research, the kind of scientifically valid research that needs to be done across the globe because of people's continued prejudice against people of African descent, people of color, and the often horrendous interpretations of what data are there. They're often interpreted in very derogatory ways for the people of color. So, we have to change our mindset so that young people become engaged and want to study and go back to their communities and study their communities. We also need teams that are not just geneticists, but they need to have historians and linguists and others. They need to be interdisciplinary teams because this story is not just a story that's going to be relayed in the genes. It's also going to show up in the languages and in the demography and so forth. So Otherwise, we simply tell stories that everyone knows, but at the molecular level.
Let me add a few details to that, because I think what we've seen through large consortium projects, either focally based in continental areas or in countries who have diverse populations like China, for example, that we are beginning to get some glimpse of the diversity of peoples in these particular places. I'm involved with the Genographic Project, which is a National Geographic sponsored project to study global diversity, and we've worked in many corners of the world that people have not been to before. We're just publishing a paper on Aboriginal Australians, a few papers where we know very little about those communities, but the diversity there is actually quite extraordinary. And in concert with historians, with going from the languages and so forth, we now have a new chapter in human history that both we and those communities can actually be able to read and to be able to understand, especially communities who've been devastated by European contact through disease and admixture and so forth, who've lost their cultural moorings in their languages because of the process of colonization. So in some ways I'm echoing the point that you're making, but also try to say that we actually are making some advances in being able to get a broader understanding of the diversity of peoples across the globe, the adaptive processes and experiences they've had through this process of many thousands of years, and simply the great diversity of genetics, of DNA that actually emerges when you begin to do this kind of work in those places.
Yes.
Can you talk about this from a standpoint of when this discovery, as this discovery continues to go on? And we were talking backstage about the meaning of race. What will that evolve to once information is known about movements of people and the similarities among people and that?
I'm such an optimist, so we'll probably conflict on this idea, but I really believe that I'm a proponent of everyone being genetically tested. Because once you get massive genomic testing, then you begin to see the overlap, and you begin to see how you're related to that other person over there that you thought you had nothing in common with. And so I see the technology providing information that, if we are open-minded, will really force us to bring it to come together. So then this notion of sociological race becomes much more tied to selected ethnicity. And someone like our President Obama, who chooses to be African American because he has a very broad genetic heritage, but he chose to be African American, that becomes then more meaningful in terms of his identity than some kind of artificial assumption of what population he belongs in.
Well, I think that genetics is definitely, in science in general, has definitely influenced ordinary ideas of race throughout time. But also, you'd be surprised the extent to which we will use genetics or use science in general to support ideas of race that we were going to develop anyway, right? And this, of course, happened a lot more in the 18th century, 19th century, people like Morton and so forth. Sorry, Morton.
Sorry, Martin.
And think about what's going on right now in the U.S. Census Bureau, right? We are considering adding Arab category. Actually, it's a MENA, Middle Eastern, North African category, which kind of veers a little bit from the Office of Management Budgets. Classification of races, they've got 5. The census has been pushed to add more than 5 because of what? Because of the pressure that ordinary people are putting onto the Census Bureau to add those. Now, does that have anything to do with genetics? Well,
No.
yeah, not that much, right?
No.
So I think that we're going to be changing our ideas of race throughout time for reasons that are less and less connected to science as we go on because of the political struggle that we've had in the past.
But here's in the UK, the forensic DNA database in the UK had also added the category of Arab fairly recently. And that category of, the categories in that DNA database, so they're all based on ethnicities. And the reason why a person will end up in one group and not the other is because of the officer who's going to take the swab will determine what this person, to what population this person belongs to. And the rationale for that is the person is not interested in their self-assignment or something like that, but because if the person would commit a crime and any other person on the street would see that same individual, they will classify accordingly to the officer who's taking the swab. So here's a kind of racial categorization that are in society that are already implemented in the architecture of the DNA database. So, and this is why I think we have to think, I mean, even though I find it extremely important for the benefits of, for understanding diseases and developing other strategies for care, to do the DNA research, at the same time I'm also wary for how the kind of knowledge that we produce for this one purpose will travel and be used for totally different kinds of, to do different kind of work and there introduce race. So I think we can never be on the safe side. So while we do this, while we do you know, enlarge our DNA databases, while we do the kind of medical research, we also have to be aware of the very complex world that we are living in and that data can be used for other kind of purposes as well. So it is this kind of problems.
The way you describe that, I think back to the commercial television applications that you see when, I don't know which database they advertise, but the guy's dancing in a German lederhosen and then suddenly he's in a Scottish kilt. But isn't that still basing people on an artificial thing? It's a nationality, right? It's not basing them on a group of people, but basing them on some artificial political board. And isn't that a danger in everyone doing that?
That's problematic. That's what is it? Commercialization, direct-to-consumer genomic testing.
Right.
I think is what it's called, and it's almost a joke because especially when you're looking at African populations, because the genes that they're looking at existed, they emerged way before any of these ethnic groups that they're being ascribed to existed. So, you know, in one family, they'll say, you're Yoruba, and you're Hausa, and you're Igbo, and this is all, but all these people are siblings, you know? So it's almost a joke, but we have a often genetically uneducated public whose idea about mutation is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. and thinks, you know, and Spider-Man, a spider bites you and then you have all these powers, right? So that's the level of knowledge, unfortunately, that too many of our co-citizens approach genetics. And so they don't understand the time depth, for example, that Dr. Tishkoff mentioned in terms of the origin of our species. Therefore, they can't understand the connections, and they think that wearing the kilt is mandatory if they have genes from a Celtic population.
Right.
You know, it's so silly, but that's why extensive genomic testing for all of us will begin to show overlap, and you know, maybe I'll have to go put on a kilt, you know?
So actually, I have an example. Well, there are two things. One is in the presentation on genetics, there was that slide where it showed, I think, someone of African ancestry, and they said their percentages.
Right.
Did you see the one that said central and southern, like hunter-gatherers, 6% or something? I almost guarantee there's like no way.
No way.
And we know that from history, right?
Yes.
From documentation of the slave trade, and there is no hunter-gatherer ancestry. But there was another, I heard a presentation from someone from Ancestry.com, and there is a lot they can do nowadays, and particularly in Europe, they can say sort of Northern Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Africa. There's not even a database, as you said, so we can't easily ascribe. And people here in the US often are of West African ancestry, and as you said, it's hard to distinguish between groups. And so they showed someone who self-identified as Hispanic, and then she did the test, and then it said something like, you are 20% African, and this percent European, and this percent Native American. And she goes, oh, this whole time I thought I was Hispanic, and actually I'm African. And like suddenly her whole identity just shifted because of that genetic test.
Yeah.
I'm like, that seems kind of silly. I mean,
Yeah.
identity shouldn't be based just on that.
Well, I've worked a lot with consumer genomics organizations and helped some get started, so I may have a slightly different point of view about this, although I agree that the way that's advertised is perhaps, say, you know, well, overstating what the test results are and done perhaps in a humorous way to at least stimulate interest in sending in a swab. But I think a lot of the basic reason that many of us are doing this work is because there's a basic question that we all have, and that's where we come from and who we're related to, and in some sense why we're here. What is our history? And everybody, every individual out there, and in ourselves and everybody in these communities that we're working with wants to know those sorts of questions. Often identity is tied to genealogy, to your relatives. So although the way in which this is being approached at a consumer genomics level may be a bit silly, in fact, it's addressing a basic need or a question that people have.
Oh, yeah.
So, and this is also important for people who are adopted, who may be foundlings, who have, have siblings, sometimes want to know who the sperm donor is in terms of their father and reconnect in some important sorts of ways. So on the other hand, it is extremely important to have adequate information to be able to make those evaluations as to what your ancestry is, what proportion of different communities across Africa happens to be, given the complexity of African history and so forth. Mm-hmm. And I agree that's where much of the information needs to be filled in, because Africa, I think, is you're quite right. It's the most extraordinary place from a whole number of reasons, including our roots there. And yet we have such a really tentative hold on the knowledge that's there that it's so important for understanding the basis, the genesis of our species, but also for people who want to know about their own African heritage, whatever that might be.
Yes, I agree.
But we're headed towards this from a medical perspective as well. I mean,
Yes.
when you start talking about Ashkenazi Jews and others that have very specific things to look at, that's where we're headed with this.
Although I wouldn't call that race specific, because again, just by using that terminology, we're reinforcing these often biological concepts.
Isn't that a conflict, though, in the medical community there, sort of calling it that?
See, so I just came from a meeting discussing exactly this issue. It's a huge problem that many people in the biomedical community do sometimes refer to races, and they'll say, I hate the word when they say Caucasian race, because it just like reinforces a concept that was based on biological classifications, or sort of what Morton did. Mm-hmm. But the fact is that race is inherently an intertwining of biological and social and cultural classifications that don't make sense. So we should avoid even using that word, in my opinion, and particularly in the medical literature, stop referring to these groups as races. You could say Ashkenazi Jewish population or ethnic group. That is important to know, however, because people who have Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry have a high incidence of certain types of genetic disorders. And that's something that, you may want to screen for them. There's a number of reasons you want to know that. And we do know that people all over the world, one of the basic tenets of human genetics or genetic diseases, they typically do differ in prevalence in ethnic groups. Now, and they're classic examples like sickle cell anemia is very common in people of African descent because it was adaptive to have one copy that's not sickle cell and one that's sickle cell. It's protective against malaria. So it rose to high frequency, and now we see it also in people of African descent in the US. Now there are other diseases that are very complex, like hypertension and diabetes, and they're caused by many genes and the environment. There it's tricky because we do see differences amongst ethnic groups in prevalence, but that's very difficult to disentangle the genetic and the environmental components, and that's something people still argue about, I think, quite a bit.
So I was just interested. So is there a sense, because this was the NIH meeting that you're talking about, right? Is there a sense that somehow not using the word is going to change the realities that might take part in bringing about the disparities between the groups? So, for example, there are people who would call Jewish people a race, regardless of whether biomedical researchers would call them a race. That sort of interaction in society, being treated as a race by those people, might influence certain disparities, epigenetic phenomena, and so forth. So is the idea to just not use it among biomedical researchers, or is there a bigger sort of project to try to tell ordinary people that they shouldn't be using race in a certain way?
Yeah, so I think they're not that naive. Racism goes beyond, what the biomedical researchers say. There's going to be racism irregardless of what they refer to different groups. but we don't need to reinforce it and, and add to this by calling these groups races. In a way, we kind of have to, because NIH makes us classify based on race. That's a discussion we're having as well. Will they continue to do that? But at some level, they are then told to do that based on the Census, right, Bureau and what they're classifying as races. But I think one of the points that we're trying to make is maybe coming up with some recommendations for scientists that maybe you don't want to refer to racial classification. Maybe it's more important to talk about ancestry or culture, ethnic group, language. It depends on the study you're doing, but try to be as specific as you possibly can. Because if a patient, even as a clinician, if they come to you and maybe someone identifies them, or they might even self-identify, I don't know, African American, but it turns out they had ancestors from the Middle East or from Italy or something, and they're anemic not because they have sickle cell, but actually, they have thalassemia or something that came from the Middle East. There's also, it's been recognized that diseases that are like cystic fibrosis, very common in Europeans, has been underdiagnosed in people of other ancestries because people label the patient and think, oh, they're not European, so.
Yeah, so they couldn't be cystic fibrosis.
Exactly.
Or couldn't be sickle cell if they're not African.
Doesn't this get to the variability of the whole substructure?
Yeah, so one of the things I'm very interested in is population substructure. And how do we take complex admixed groups, and the truth is that we're all admixed, okay? Somewhere along in our history, there's been admixture, and even highly endogamous groups where they keep marrying close relatives and so forth. Well, there's usually a loss of fitness associated with that, so they kind of fade out after a while. Admixed groups that are complex tend to be substructured because our brains are still kind of in the Paleolithic era. That is, we can't handle 1,000 people to know them intimately, or 2,000 people. We can really know maybe 50 to 100 people very well. And so what you find in complex groups like African Americans is that they will subdivide. And the subdivision usually is along geographical lines. Now, to the people outside of those communities, they may not recognize among Italians. And the ability to recognize someone from Sardinia or from Sicily right away among Italians, that they recognize the substructure. Someone outside of that community may not. And this is why the genetic tests that are done and the studies looking at ethnicity and the prevalence of particular allelic variants or genetic variants really need to have his involved with the life scientists so that the work that's done and the interpretations that are made are very sophisticated. Substructure can totally destroy your genetic paradigm if you don't recognize it, because you think you're testing this whole group of Tunisians and come to find out there's a group in the north that looks very different from the ones in the south. So that level of sophistication in our own scientific work has to be implemented if we're going to move forward. Otherwise, it feels as though we're in this loop about race and genetics, race and genetics, race and genetics, as if we can't get out of it. But we have to get out of it, as my colleagues have said, otherwise we won't have progress. And progress can be made through more data, through better education of the public, like seminars like this, and also more critical thinking and integrated interdisciplinary research, because that will force us to not just think as biologists, or not just think as geneticists, or not just think as philosophers, but to have many different eyes and hearts looking at the data and interpreting it. As I said, I'm very optimistic about this. I think we can do it, but it's going to take willpower. And usually when a bad idea like race stalls in a population, it's because it's serving some other interest. So the question is, what interest is it serving? There is no gene that is only found in one geographical group and not found in another. I mean, there's so much overlap among us. Well, I sound like a preacher, don't I? The It's the preacher Jackson.
I want to make sure. I want to make sure we have time for our audience to come up with questions, and so you may want to start getting ready with those. And you'll have two choices. If you want to bring a question up, I know some of you have cards. We'll do the question up here, but if you would like to do it yourself, the microphones remain open. Do you agree as you travel through your work in Africa, the same with the substructure?
With the substructure issues. Yes, but at the same time, I'm sort of worried. So here's my skeptical anthropological, cultural anthropological eye. Two things. So when we are talking about major diseases such as hypertension, et cetera, I think it's important. Of course, here today we're talking about genetics in relation to race, right? I find it sometimes disturbing to think that we can solve all the health issues only by going deep down in the body, looking at the micro level of the genes or going into the brain. Sometimes it's much better to simply provide good infrastructure in the neighborhood, and people will get better by that, and provide healthcare at home, and so different kind of approaches. So I don't think that the more data, the more sequencing, the more information we have about our genetic composition will be the only route to travel. So that is one. This is not to say that genetics is not important, because I care a lot about genetics. I think it's important, and we have made large advances that we should follow as well. The second is that, so the way we have been talking about this population substructures might sort of bring back via the back door, to evoke Troy Duster here, ideas about typologies. Because it's, of course, certain types of faces that we recognize as belonging to this population or to this subpopulation, and lots of other people that also belong to that population by history or culture or whatever, that do not fit in the category, and we simply overlook them. So we have to think about this. This is why I'm insisting, like, race is the trouble that we are in, and it is going to be with us, and the better we care about it and address it and keep being alert at what is happening, actually, the better. So we have to do that work. So there is no way of sort of cleaning up the mess. It is the kind of mess that we will be in, having this histories that is here, because I mean, I find the protocols working in this race face idea. Partly it's about DNA and the influence of a phenotype. Part of it is facial reconstruction based on the skeleton, and others is a photo fitting material. So in this facial reconstruction, the protocols that are there among forensic anthropologists are really very racial typological protocols that are being used on a daily practice. So there you have race, not somebody being racist, no. They're really very, very nice and gentle and well-informed people. At the same time, the protocol provokes and iterates race again. So it is that kind of silent infrastructures that are among us that we need to, well, be much more aware of, and ask the question, what kind of work is it doing? And what kind of effect, and how does it reintroduce kind of population segregations among ourselves? So,
why don't we start doing some audience questions? I believe you were first.
Thank you.
Over here.
Hello, everybody. It's an honor to be here and to listen to all of you. I was very impressed, Dr. Jackson, when you talked about the precision medicine initiative, because one of the questions that was asked by Mr. Adams was, how are we going to transcend this loophole of racism and race, okay, and genes and race? Well, precision medicine initiative is the one place to do it. I have never seen, I'm a pharmacist, I've never seen a white or a black covalent bond to make a molecule come together, okay? And I don't think that anyone here, I don't care what PhD you have or how much you've studied, can see those kinds of things too. But I do know one thing, when you take a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, oh, it will work in any of you most of the time, okay? And so in looking at this, when I look at drug metabolism and I look at things like that, It is in not only the molecular understanding or the genotype of an individual, it's in the environment, and it's also in how they feel about where they exist on Earth. And I just wanted to share that. I have noticed too, and I compliment the panel, because I've been to several things over the years. I'm an old person at the University of Penn, and your panel is diverse, and I thank you for that, okay? So I just feel that maybe those syntactical ways of talking about race will transcend into some of the articles. I was reading a recent article in New England Journal of Medicine for carbamazepine induced neurotoxicity based on UK ancestry, which was very, very interesting to look at it. Even though we talk about it that way, and we compare it to the Hmong Chinese descendants who had this same problem with this same kind of drug, okay? Even though we'll talk about ancestries or race or locations of people, just because it's at a molecular level that nobody really ever sees anyway, it will transcend this, and that's my hope for our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think if I could just add to what you're saying, you brought up something about the epigenome. And it's very important to understand that our environment has a major impact on gene expression. And so the things that we see, the food that we eat, the drugs that we take, all can influence gene expression patterns. So it's not enough simply to have the genomic information, but to couple this with a sophisticated understanding of the environment and the epigenomic changes, that is, the chemical changes in association with particular genes that will change gene expression patterns without changing the genome. So, you know, the genomic work that needs to be done has to also be coupled with the epigenomic work and a sophisticated view of the environment if we are to begin to approach precision medicine, which you're quite right is at the individual level. And in that sense, it's more important. It has at the foundation ancestry, but the precision medicine is implemented at the individual level. So what an individual's genomic and epigenomic patterns are going to be much more important in determining their medical status and susceptibilities. I think that's where we're going. And in that sense, I think the power of race will begin to fade by the wayside, because if I can get a better kidney match from someone from Ireland, then that's more important than the fact that most of my genes come from Africa. So this will transform with more knowledge.
And things have to be not only interdisciplinary, but transdisciplinary. Yes. And meaning, obviously, you need lawyers, you need people who head up policies, and people who set up guidelines to allow these changes to occur. Mm-hmm. And just because we're having this type of discussion tonight, it's already here.
Yes.
Over here.
Hi. Hello, my name is Kelsey Jones. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us. First, I just want to say I appreciate your discussion around messiness. You know, Obama was brought up as an example, and I think that I could choose all day who I'd like to be, but my choice is also very limited by how others choose to see me. And so I think that's an important thing to think about, just in terms of lived experiences. One thing I'm also thinking about is when you were discussing how people start to see themselves based on the testing they receive, and the word silly was used a couple of times, and you know, I take issue with that, because I think that people think about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, one of my favorite cartoons growing up, because that's what's accessible to me. So even here, having access to this panel, those are things to think about. What do people have access to in terms of the work you're doing? And so one question I have is around, how do you understand accessibility in your work? You know, I'm here, I'm excited. You've used many terms. I could not tell you what those terms mean, right? But to you, it's language that's familiar to you. So how do you share that kind of information in a public space, not just with people who are here who had access to something to know this was happening, And then how do you understand your ethical responsibilities around publishing and sharing your work? So I know that you spoke about going back, giving people results, and I'm specifically curious about, like, what does that look like? How do you share results? How do people understand the work that you're doing? As a researcher, that's something I struggle with in terms of accessibility. I could be doing great work, but if people don't understand the details and the nuance of what I'm doing, then I'm really just doing it for me and the 3 people who will maybe read my articles, which is also pitfalls of academia. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to that.
Yes, that was a great, great comment, actually. And you addressed a number of things that I think are really important. So it's almost, it's kind of a problem in academia, right? That when I publish my research, it's going to go into a scientific journal that's meant for other scientists. And then the way it's going to get out to the public, typically, if it's of interest enough for the general public, is some person from the press, right? The media is going to interpret it, but very often they're going to misinterpret it. And so I think that we have an important obligation that every scientist should be trained on how to talk to the media and to make sure that they get it right, because when they misinterpret it, it can cause a lot of damage, actually.
And the media should be trained how to talk to the scientists.
Yes, and no offense to
No.
someone from the media.
Don't take it.
I'm sure you do great. Right, so yeah, there was another point I was going to make and I just suddenly forgot. And then in terms of returning the results to people in Africa, that's a even bigger challenge, because it depends, many of them may not have much education beyond elementary school to middle school. And so what we do is we first frame this in sort of layman's terms, and often we'll translate to the local language. And then we bring pictures that I think explain. We weren't really, we didn't have pictures here today, but I think that helps a lot. And in fact, recently I was at a workshop in Namibia working with indigenous populations. It was a team of anthropologists and lawyers and indigenous representatives, because they wanted to talk about the ethics of doing genomics research and sort of talk about coming up with a standard set of protocols. And we spent 2 days explaining what a cell is, and I genuinely believe that by the end of that, they truly understood. They said how they wanted this research to be done. They said what they want to get in return. And I think that's how it has to be done, but those things take a long time to do it the proper way.
I'll say a little something. That's an excellent question. In philosophy, we're actually struggling with how to become more accessible, because we sort of write to a small group of people, like a lot of other academics, but we, for some reason, shrink it down even more, and we write to a very, very small group of people, and then are surprised when philosophy departments are cut in size and so forth. And what are you really contributing to the university? Well, I've got this paper I published for 2 people. But so I think it's really important, especially for academics in the humanities who are writing for a living. We write, right? And so I think we have an obligation to write books that are for the general public. And some philosophers are really good at that. Some historians are really good at that. Henry Louis Gates Jr. pops to my mind as a historian. Cornel West pops to my mind as a philosopher of race. And so I think we shouldn't even hide behind translators like the media. We should directly take it to the people in forms of popularly accessible books. Now, there's also something that's complex here that affects me. I'm not sure other people on the panel, probably just me. In terms of getting tenure, you have to write to a small group of people because the faculty in your department typically don't judge how accessible your work was to the general public. They want to see that you've established yourself as an expert in some particular topic first, and then after you get tenure, you can write for the general public. So I'll put this obligation on the tenured professors to make their work more accessible because I'm still trying to get tenure. But definitely after I get tenure, I want to do the publicly accessible stuff more, and I think people in humanities have an obligation to do more of that.
Let me just do some housekeeping here. Kate, I don't see any of us with a watch on. I don't know how we're doing on time.
I've got one. It's 8:40.
8:40. Okay, we have about 20 minutes left, so we'll
May I
go.
add, I'd like to add one, just to follow up to the question about accessibility, because I think it's actually, it's really crucial, and it's also an ethical responsibility to the people that we work with, since they're giving us samples to work with, and trusting us to do the work properly and return results to them. So I would just echo a few of the points that Dr. Tishkoff made. Visiting communities and giving back results in intelligible form is actually quite crucial. We spend a lot of time, I'm supposed maybe more than Dr. Tishkoff, on the internet, talking with people and sending them documents, sending them copies of the paper that we write, having them co-author the papers with us on projects, which I think also is a case for Dr. Tishkoff's work. So there has to be basically you're forming partnerships with people, and that means you have to be in constant communication, or at least in routine communication. And you're basically building relationships that be sustained over some number of time. And they want to learn as much as you want to learn from working with them. So I really think this is an important point that we as scholars, researchers, need to keep in mind when establishing projects and putting in the time to basically set up the foundation for that work over the short and the long term, so people feel like they are actually getting something out of participating in research projects.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Hi, my name is Mercedes Richard. I'm a senior biology Spanish double major at Howard University, and I would like to say thank you before I begin to the panelists for your contributions. Firstly, I would like to address your concern for more African American involvement in research, especially with clinical trials and so forth and so on. I realize that a lot of our resistance to involving ourselves in clinical trials and research involving scientists is generated from our knowledge of things like, for example, the Tuskegee experiment, where several hundreds of people were unknowingly given syphilis and had to undergo the symptoms and pass on, their symptoms and several other things to their children, and it followed generations and generations. And this is something that continues to go on in the world today. Johns Hopkins is undergoing a lawsuit for their experiments in, I believe it's Guatemala, for giving the indigenous peoples their diseases and seeing how the experiments work on them. And so it definitely generates some skepticism for me, and the thought of genomics and the specificity of medicine in that realm, especially as it pertains to precision medicine. As the pharmacist earlier mentioned, I don't recall your name, my apologies. As she had mentioned, the medicine, like your anti-inflammatory works, in a general basis. So I'm wondering how genomic testing can influence whether or not, this will work better or more poorly in a person. So, I'm wondering, are you testing for dosage, or what types of medicine works better for a specific person? What are you looking to do specifically? Also, I believe, I can't remember which panelist mentioned it, but I thank them for mentioning the fact that Africa has the largest amount of genetic diversity. With that in mind, how can you possibly hope to have all the genomic sequences that you need for precision medicine? And a follow-up to that is that people of the African diaspora are hybrids of sorts. We're an admixture. So how do you take the genomic sequences that you get from Africa and hope to apply it to people of the African diaspora?
Okay, so how about I'll start and then you.
I'll do ancient DNA, you do SIPs.
Sure. So you asked a lot of really good questions, and so I have to try to remember all of them. Now, you raised the really terrible history that we have in terms of experiments that were done on African Americans, for example. And because of that, there were major changes made. That's actually what led to the modern Institutional Review Board, and they are extremely thorough now. They were not in the past. They've done horrible things. And it's continuing to change. There are probably things that need to get better, actually, as we speak. And because of that bad history, it is there's a disproportionate number of minorities, particularly African Americans who are participating in genomic studies. This is a big problem because my concern is that if people are not participating, they're not going to benefit from the knowledge that's going to come out. And one of the goals of the National Institutes of Health is, this meeting I just attended was on this topic, how are we going to increase, how can we make sure that diverse people in the US are included in the precision medicine effort? And that's going to have to be a combination of the scientists and sociologists and local communities, and I'm sure Fatima will have more to say about that. Now, in terms of what they can do with that data once they get it, so some of it is generalizable to everybody. So when you identify regions of the genome that play a role in disease risk, for example, you might learn something about a target for therapeutics. So you might be able to develop new drugs. So recently, there was a drug developed for heart attacks, I believe, that was identified by looking at someone who had really low cholesterol, and they happened to have a mutation in this one gene. And from sequencing that person and finding that mutation, they developed this amazingly effective drug, which will work in all people. However, we know that there are differences at genes that play a role in metabolizing drugs. And they differ amongst all of us in this room at an individual level, and they differ in populations around the world. One of the reasons that might be is we think that they may be adaptive to things like diet, for example. So there weren't medicines, 10,000 years ago. There were indigenous, medicines. But it may have been an adaptation to diet. So we know people differ. And the problem is, I just came from a pharmacogenomics meeting in Vancouver. There is so little known about diversity other than in mainly Europeans and Asians. It is astounding. And so ultimately, if we want to develop therapeutics that will be effective in everybody, we need to know that. But then there's the diagnostic component. And ultimately, when they get to the point, if they ever get to the point where they're sequencing genomes or whatever, it actually will be important to know if at that particular gene you have a protein, you have the DNA sequence that codes for a protein that's fast metabolism of drugs or slow metabolism. That could have a major impact on how you react to those drugs. So that's why I think it's important.
And the dosage.
Yeah, that's very true. And in terms of the part of your question that asked about testing in Africa and then being able to link this back to African Americans or Africans of the transatlantic diaspora, we know that contemporary Africans have been evolving, okay, even after the ancestors of diasporic Africans separated. So we are not necessarily identical to contemporary Africans, even though the bulk of our ancestry is from Africa. So we've been looking in my lab at the Cobb Research Lab at Howard, we've been looking at 400 years of African American biological history at the ancient DNA that we pull out of particular anatomical structures in those individuals, extract the DNA, sequence it, and then try to understand what were the sequences that were prevalent 400 years ago, 300 years ago, 200 years ago, 100 years ago. And then we can begin to see the effects of selection over that 400-year period. It may be that the African population that best explains the diversity we see in modern-day African Americans is actually 400 years old or 300 years old. So ancient DNA, which we haven't talked too much about, but it gives us a different kind of window on human diversity. Recognizing again that all living populations are evolving, and Africans today are not the same as they were 400 years ago or 500 years ago. So this is important again. And I guess I'm still thinking about the young lady who asked the questions about accessibility, because we all have a responsibility to learn as much as we can about the world around us. All of us have that. You know, I'm not a physicist, but I'm very interested in the landings on Mars, you know? So I have to educate myself, and we all have to do that. You know, scientists have a responsibility to make their knowledge available to the public the public has a responsibility to seek out that knowledge and to begin to learn the terminology as best they can to understand that knowledge. It's this
Thank
meeting
you.
that will make progress.
Let's, this side over here.
Yeah.
Let's try to keep them a little shorter so we
Okay.
can get more people in before we run out of time.
And on that last point, I was just going to say it's support NPR, right?
Oh, yes,
So-
absolutely. Thumbs up.
Actually, Dr. Jackson, you just sort of answered my question a little bit about the ancient DNA, because I thought that that was sort of a big hole that was missing in a lot of the genetic ancestry tests were contemporary samples or based on contemporary samples. So I was happy to hear that you mentioned that. That's great. Thanks. How do you get those?
How do
Can
we
you get it from
Here they
bone?
are. There they
Is
are.
it in bone?
So fortunately, we have a couple of experts in the audience who've been working on that issue. Chris Cross, Chris, do you want to stand up or raise your hand? And Fatima Jackson, who's a computational biologist. They've been working on extracting DNA from these old samples in the Cobb Research Lab, and they get them from the cementum of the tooth, from the root of the tooth, as well as from the petrous bone. The petrous bone is inside near the temporal area. And so from each of these skulls, for example, we could extract the petrous bone without really damaging the exterior of the cell, of the skull, and get high quality DNA, even for these old samples. I hope it's something that you all will consider doing at
But the one thing we can't do yet is we don't get well-preserved DNA in Africa from ancient samples, so from those that are 50,000 years or 100,000 years. And so
Very difficult.
my lab and others have some evidence that there was interbreeding with archaic populations in
Right.
Africa, just like outside of Africa, but we don't have the DNA from those because we don't have remains that preserve well.
Yeah.
Over here.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening. Dr. Jackson, you spoke about collaboration between other social scientists. There was a missed opportunity last December in your neck of the woods in December, the Gene Editing Summit.
It was a missed opportunity to what?
For you talked about collaboration with other social scientists
Yeah.
in regards to making decisions on this. Why weren't there any social scientists invited to speak? I mean, they were in the house, but they weren't invited to speak.
You
The
said
Gene Editing Summit in
I don't know
DC
about that.
2015.
Do you know about
Gene
that?
Editing Summit in DC in 2015.
Last year.
I don't know, I wasn't there for that. They didn't invite me either. I wasn't there, but you know what? When was it that we had this in North Carolina? Was it 2010, 2012? 2012, we had a big conference on genetic diversity in peoples of African descent and the African diaspora. And we had historians speaking, we had geneticists speaking. In other words, we tried to live out the interdisciplinary approach, and that worked very well.
Well, my question really is, in regards to the SCOTUS decision with Myriad,
With Myriad?
What decision?
What decision?
What decision?
the SCOTUS decision against Myriad, they wanted to patent the BRCA gene.
Oh, the
Oh, BRCA,
Yeah.
BRCA 1 and 2.
Yeah.
And,
What about it?
well, are you familiar with Dr. Venter and Dr. Ronsberg? Dr. Ronsberg, he replicated synthetic nucleotides XX and YY, and Dr. Venter replicated a synthetic genome self-replicating.
I read about it.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
So since they struck down, you can't patent a natural gene, but you can patent a synthetic gene.
Yes.
How would that work out in regards to three-person IVF?
Personalized IVF?
I don't know.
It's,
but-
it's,
Three- you know what three-person
mitochondrial replacement
Yeah,
therapy.
thank you.
Oh,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
That might be outside of our realm, although I do
Yes.
think you
Alright.
raise an important issue about gene patenting, and it's a horrible thing what happened with the BRCA1. That's a gene that has people who have a certain mutation or mutations have a very high risk for disease, and it is common in certain groups, including African Americans, Ashkenazi Jews, and others. And that was terrible that it prevented affordable tests. And now I guess they turned it down. They
They struck that
Yeah,
down,
struck
but
it
they
down.
said you
Which
can't
was a
synthetic.
victory.
If it's synthetic, you can patent it.
Well, let's hope that
And what
doesn't. You're right,
Ronsberg
that's-
did and what Ventnor did is putting it right in that realm
Yeah.
in regards to what Dr. I don't know.
We
the
may have to
doctor's
get
name.
another panel together.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
There is a
Yeah,
race
that's a
and
legal
medicine
question.
panel coming
Yeah.
up, so we'll talk about that. We have 5 minutes left, so.
Yeah, good evening. I've enjoyed the conversation and the panelists. I'd like to thank the university for having a discussion. I think a year and a half ago, a former United States Attorney General, Eric Holloman, said that America is scared to discuss the issue of race. So it's nice to see that Penn took it on. I'd like to know if I could make a theological comment to the whole group concerning man. I'm a Baptist preacher. I believe the Bible that God created man in his image. I believe in the creation story, the sixth day that God created man. He created man from the dust of the earth. And through the man Adam, then he had a wife. A lot of your experiments, and I think it's good, but man came from the hand of God. I think number 2, we're all graveyard travelers. Otherwise, eventually, if I came back here 100 years. And then the other thing I think in terms of race, that you could look at the different races. I think one of the panelists mentioned the Italian race. And 50 years ago, I dated a girl in New York, and she told her Italian girlfriend, the northern Italian does not like the southern Italian because of Hannibal intermarried with the Italian women of the South. And so this girl, Italian girl, went home and asked her parents, and they said that was true, that the northern Italian doesn't like the southern Italian. So there's different myths and race come up about man, and I believe that man's been here almost 6,000 years. From the Jewish calendar, 5,700 some odd years. That man has been upon the face of the earth. But I've enjoyed your discussions and the scientists, and I'll be back, Lord willing, the next 2. And so it's been great. And once again, you took a great issue of race. Where do we come from? Where are we going? How did I get here? And what is my future?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Last one, and I think the panel will be around for a couple minutes if you want to come up and ask anything directly. Last one.
Hi, thank you for being here. So I really want to understand how I should see science and race and how they're really not connected, but I feel like I got left way back at the starting line, and I'm hoping that I can understand when I leave here how I should see it. So, like, for example, I'm adopted, but I'm obviously pretty pale. So what should I understand about my, like, race or lack thereof based on my white skin color? Like, is that genetic? Is it not genetic? Does it matter?
Complex. It is genetic, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you bring up, people often think of race based on skin color, as we heard in the introductory talk, and it's really a terrible way to classify people, because we have people of very dark skin color in Australia, in India, in any place where there's a lot of UV exposure. And in fact, one of the things that my lab studies is differences in skin color amongst people in Africa, and there's a huge amount of variation, and people don't realize that. So that's a terrible classifier. And then someone mentioned earlier, they asked about albinos, and they mentioned, are they like closer to us? I actually got that same question in Africa. When I was presenting the results, there's a lot of albinos in certain regions, and they asked me exactly that question. And I said, no, they are just like you. You have to treat them like your brothers and sisters, because it's just a single mutation in one gene that's the difference that causes albinism. And in terms of your identity, I think that's a much broader, goes beyond genetics, I would think,
Right.
but maybe
Right,
others can
absolutely.
comment.
I mean, your identity, you never want to give up your identity to a pipetting geneticist. It's just, your identity is too complex. It's too important. And plus, our identities are also evolving as we live our lives. So,
I guess I would just ask this. Is it like, scientifically true to say that I'm white? Or is that only something that's a social thing?
Do you mean white like European descent, or do you mean white skin color?
I guess that's my question.
And that's the answer. So it depends on what you mean by white, right? It depends on what you mean by race. Science can't tell you what we mean by race.
Okay.
We give meanings to words.
Yeah, it's a
Scientists
social
can
thing.
inform our decisions about, what else that entails. But we carve that up. We carve up who's of what race and so forth. So,
And it's constantly shifting, you know?
No clear boundary.
So the boundaries are shifting. At one time, Southern Italians were considered people of color.
But that's not to say that there aren't differences, right? There are differences. We all look around. We're all different from each other. We can often maybe infer from looking at someone a broad geographic region, right? So we're not denying that there are genetic differences amongst people, but there are no firm boundaries, and they simply reflect our history and migrations and things like that. And as Fatima said, the history of humans, from what I can see, this even goes back to like when we left Africa and we started interbreeding with Neanderthals. We just love to interbreed with.
Yeah, we're lovers.
Lovers, not fighters.
Admixture is the norm. That's like pretty much the rule, I would say.
Yeah.
Can I please say something apropos the Neanderthal? I was in France for the holidays in the summer, and I was struck by the reconstruction of the Neanderthal. Nowadays he looks white. There were days where he looks almost like an ape and almost Negro.
Yes.
Now that we know that there is intermingling between Europeans and the Neanderthal, he has become a brother, right? And I think that's important to notice that. Secondly, I really like your question, and I took it actually as a kind of provocation rather than that we are going to solve your problem, so to speak. Because I think, as you said at the beginning, it is important to raise the question, what is race? And not to answer that conclusively or universally. We need to ask this question again and again, because race is a surprise in what it's going to be made, you know, if we, and whether we are talking evolutionary biology, craniology, criminology, societal constructions of race, you will have the whole history of racial classification popping up again and again. So there is no way of advancing, of leaving certain things behind. It is that kind of messiness that will be among us again and again. Certain contexts, all of a sudden, we had this wonderful classification, and now it becomes relevant again. We have white races, we have Jewish races all of a sudden, and then they disappear, and they will come back. So this is what I mean by we have to stay put and pay attention to what race is, how we make it, what kind of work it is doing among us. There is no way of answering the question in general as a kind of comment to yours, but thank you for your question, because I think it is an important one.
And with that, we'll have to...
May I add one quick comment?
One quick thing.
As another white person, I'd like to give an example of this that actually confounds the notion of whiteness and European ancestry, which I think ancestry is perhaps a better guide to understanding the relationship between skin color, hair color, eye color, stature, body form, and so forth. So I've done a lot of testing on myself as a researcher interested in this question, and I wasn't quite sure what I was going to find because I was adopted. So when I did the testing, I came out, maybe not to any surprise, I have very strongly European ancestry. It's about 99.2%. Wow. But what I found, though, is because many of my ancestors are Finnish, is that I have 0.8% native Siberian ancestry. And this is because the people who came over mixing to form the Sami populations are a blend of people of Asian and European descent who then mixed with the Finns, who actually came themselves out of the Iberian Peninsula after the last glacial maximum. So Europeans are a real conglomerate, a mixture of people's comings and goings, but here I am, I'm a white guy, and I have a little bit of a native Siberian or Asian ancestry, despite the fact I show no phenotypic attributes of the native people that I actually have worked with in the past. So you never know what you're going to find when you study yourself, as whether you're an African American, European American, Asian, whatever. There's a mixture in here and surprises and details, which give you some idea perhaps about identity and where your ancestry is, but it just shows you that our identity from a biological perspective is really quite complex, and you can't judge a book by its cover in that regard.
Thank you, and with that, we'll leave the rest up to your interpretation. What we need to do is we need to thank the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage for their support of Public Classroom at the Penn Museum, and media partners WHYY and WURD. Please visit the Public Classroom website, take the survey for this class if you would. The input is very valuable to everyone. And hold the date. Join for the next class, Geography, Culture, and Race, November 9th at 6:30, right here at the Penn Museum. You can live stream it from home. Thank you for being here, everybody. Thank you to the panel.
Thank you.